you that the name Zachary isn't actually a name.
Right. Or at least, not in the way we traditionally understand names today.
Exactly. Because if you're listening to this right now, you probably know a Zachary.
Oh, sure.
I mean, you might have even named your own child Zachary because it sounded friendly or strong or, maybe it was a family name.
Yeah, super common.
But what if, for literally the last several thousand years, people have been passing down a highly engineered, like a mathematically precise, legally binding equation without even realizing it?
Which sounds crazy, I know.
It totally does.
Yeah.
But we are taking a massive detour today from how we normally look at historical texts. We are going to strip away the English alphabet, we are going to ignore how words actually sound, and we are going to look purely at the raw mathematical letter count of ancient history. Okay, let's unpack this because
Oh, what's fascinating here is that it's a radical departure from how most of us were taught to read in the first place.
right.
The sources we're diving into today, specifically this really deeply technical analysis document titled The Orthography of the Name in the Salvation Mirror, they argue that we have essentially been blinded by phonetic drift.
Phonetic drift.
Yeah, like we've been looking at ancient scriptural names as if they were just phonetic labels.
Yeah.
Arbitrary sounds assigned to historical figures.
Just a tag, like, hey, that guy's name is Bob.
Exactly. But this research posits a framework called orthography, and specifically this concept of letter custody, which suggests these names are actually microscopic structural architectures.
Okay, I want to spend a moment on that term letter custody, because honestly, it is the absolute beating heart of this entire deep dive.
It really is the anchor.
Think about it like this. When we read a translated text today, we are experiencing the final compiled software.
That's a good way to put it.
Right. We click a button, the app opens, we see the interface, we see Isaiah or Joshua in English. But this source material is asking us to basically become developers looking at the raw underlying binary code.
Yeah, looking at the actual ones and zeros.
Yes. The core premise is that the original written witness-like, the literal physical marks a scribe made on a piece of parchment 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, that must be counted and respected before any inherited spelling or pronunciation or translation tradition is allowed to have a voice.
And if we accept that framework, it forces us to confront a very uncomfortable reality about language.
Which is?
That languages evolve, they drift. Over centuries of phonetic tradition, like how a culture actually speaks a word out loud around a campfire, it can preserve a form, but it can also, distort it.
Or beautify it.
Exactly. Beautify it, expand it. A Latin translation might add a letter just to make a word sound more poetic. An English transliteration might try to capture some guttural sound and literally invent a new spelling to accommodate it.
Right, because English is weird like that.
Very weird.
Okay.
But the source text we are analyzing establishes this unbending law right out of the gate. A later language cannot retroactively change the original written letter count.
You can't just go back in time.
You can't. If a word was originally written with 5 Hebrew characters, it remains a 5-letter container, period. A later vocal tradition can't reach back and erase or alter the physical mathematical reality of those 5 marks.
So this makes me think of DNA sequencing.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, if you have a specific strand of DNA, you have a fixed sequence of base pairs, right? Adenine, thymine, cytosine, guanine.
Right, the building blocks.
And if a scientist centuries later decides to describe that strand using a completely different set of symbols, or tries to group certain pairs together because they look similar under a microscope.
It doesn't change the biological reality of the original sequence.
Exactly. The physical code is a physical code. Flour and water is just flour and water, even if the picture on the box looks like a cake.
That is a very apt way to frame it. The DNA sequence doesn't care about the language the scientist uses to describe it. And in this analysis, the very first act of truth is not figuring out how an ancient civilization might have sounded out a word. The first act of truth is simply counting the characters on the page. The source states it really bluntly: 2 Hebrew letters are 2 Hebrew letters, 5 Hebrew letters are 5 Hebrew letters. It demands that we prioritize counting over interpretation.
Okay, but this immediately raises a huge barrier for anyone who, like me, grew up reading these texts in translation.
Sure, it's jarring.
It's incredibly jarring. We are so used to sounding things out. If I see a J, an A, and an H on a page, my brain immediately tells me to pronounce jaw.
Right, your brain just does the math for you phonetically.
Exactly. It's incredibly difficult to uncouple the visual letter from the phonetic sound we've been conditioned to make. So if we are going to actually understand this architectural blueprint, where do we start? I mean, we can't just dive into massive complex names without understanding the basics.
No, we have to start at the absolute foundational floor. According to the structural blueprint laid out in this research, before you can build a monument, you need a cornerstone.
Okay, lay the cornerstone for me.
This source identifies the cornerstone of this entire mathematical structure as a specific, isolated divine name consisting of exactly 2 letters.
Just two.
Just 2. And in the Hebrew alphabet, those 2 specific letters are Yod and Hey.
Yod and Hey. Okay, let's translate those into our alphabet so we can track the math as we go.
Good idea. Based on their inherent values, Yod corresponds to I and Hey corresponds to A.
So I...
A, exactly. The 2-letter foundational block is IA. And the text we were analyzing is fiercely protective of this boundary. It argues that this 2-letter block is the immutable starting point.
It's the flour and water.
Yes, it is not 3 letters. It is not an English Yah with a phantom H tacked onto the end.
Right.
It is not a Jah with a Latin J that didn't even exist when the text was written.
Right.
And it is certainly not the longer pronunciation package Yahoo. The original physical witness, the literal strokes of ink on the parchment, is exactly 2 letters. Yod and Hey, IA.
Okay, I am going to push back on this right away.
I figured you might.
Well, I have to, because anyone who has taken even a cursory look at ancient biblical history or Hebrew or theology knows that there is a massive focus on the 4-letter name.
The Tetragrammaton.
The Tetragrammaton, exactly, YHWH. It is arguably the most famous linguistic construct in ancient scripture. It is everywhere. So how does this source justify claiming that the foundational structural block is only 2 letters when there is this universally recognized 4-letter form dominating the texts?
That's a totally fair question.
It feels like ignoring a skyscraper to focus on a single brick.
It does feel like that, but that is the exact tension this source addresses. And it requires a very nuanced reading of the scripture itself to understand the argument. The author is not denying the existence or the importance of the 4-letter Tetragrammaton.
Okay, so they aren't pretending it's not there.
Not at all. The argument is about custody and function. Where is the foundational anchor for these specific mathematical name constructs? To answer that, the source points us away from general usage and directly towards specific, explicit definitions given within the ancient texts themselves.
Like, it gives us a dictionary definition.
Basically, yes. Specifically in Proverbs 18.2 and Psalm 68.
Okay, let's pull those up. What is the precise mechanism happening in those verses?
Let's look at Proverbs 18.57 first. The text says, "The name of YHWH is a strong tower." Now, the source draws our attention to a vital grammatical distinction here. The verse does not simply state YHWH is a strong tower.
Oh, I see.
It places a specific concept, the concept of the name in front of the 4-letter form. It says the name of YHWH. It is isolating a specific characteristic or a localized element.
So it's acting like a highlighter.
Yes.
It's pointing at the larger entity, but saying, I want you to focus on this very specific attribute right here, the name part.
Exactly. And then the source argues Psalm 68 takes that highlighter and shows us exactly what is being highlighted.
What does Psalm 68 say?
It contains a phrase that explicitly identifies this precise name form. In Hebrew, the phrase translates to "in or by IA is his name."
Wait, really? It literally says that?
It literally places the 2-letter form, Yod-He, which is IA, in direct explicit equation with the phrase, his name.
Wow.
So the structural argument being made is that when the ancient authors wanted to isolate the name as a foundational building block, as that specific strong tower of custody, they explicitly pointed to the 2-letter sequence, Yod-He, IA.
That implies a level of textual self-awareness that is staggering. I mean, it means these writers weren't just throwing words onto a page. They were defining their own variables, like a mathematician setting up an equation before solving it.
Let X equal IA.
Exactly. Yeah. They are defining the variable name as the 2-letter value IA. But I still struggle with how we can be so sure about this 2-letter isolation. Is there any external historical evidence for this, or is this just a modern linguistic theory being projected backward onto the text?
No, it's not just modern theory. The source actually brings in external historical testimony to reinforce this. It specifically cites a 5th century historian and theologian named Theodoret of Cyrus.
Okay, what did Theodoret say?
He preserved a very specific historical distinction regarding how different ancient groups interacted with these texts. He recorded that the Samaritans utilized a longer phonetic form, which he transcribed into Greek as Iabi.
Yeah, okay, so a longer sound.
Right. But while they did that, The Jews, who were the actual custodians of the specific textual tradition we are examining, they preserved a distinctly shorter witness. Theodore recorded it simply as Iaya,
Yeah,
2 letters.
just Aya.
So even hundreds of years after these texts were originally compiled, ancient historians were observing a strict division.
Exactly.
There were groups expanding the pronunciation, adding vowels and breaths to make it a longer sound, and then there was a group stubbornly holding on to this abbreviated 2-letter witness, Ia.
It demonstrates that this strict two-letter isolation is not a modern contrivance. It was a known, observable phenomenon in antiquity. This two-letter block, Yadhe, is the unadorned core.
The pure DNA, right? Think about the physical reality of a scribe in the ancient Near East. They are not typing on a keyboard. They are laboriously scratching marks into leather or papyrus. Every single stroke matters.
Yeah, they aren't going to just add letters for fun.
No. When they construct this foundational block, they make exactly 2 characters. If a translator, thousands of years later, decides to spell it with a J, an A, and an H, because that's how it sounds in their local dialect, they have fundamentally broken the mathematics of the original text.
They've added a Latin letter that the original scribe never wrote.
Yes.
They've contaminated the DNA sample. They've introduced foreign genetic material into the sequence. If the original sequence only has 2 base pairs, you can't just add a third one and pretend it's the same organism.
And that concept of contamination is why the law of custody is so rigid in this document. If you add a letter, you change the math. You change the custody point. The unbending starting point for everything we are about to discuss is this. Iota alpha in Greek corresponds to Yod-He in Hebrew. IA corresponds to Yod-He. It is a 2-letter container.
Okay, I am tracking. So if IA acts as this immutable 2-letter cornerstone, the obvious next question is, what gets built on top of it?
Right.
If I am an ancient author or even an ancient parent, how do I use those 2 letters to actually construct a person's identity? How do I build a monument out of those blocks?
This brings us to a really fascinating concept detailed in the source, which revolves around the idea of a memorial.
Memorial. Okay.
Let's look at how this plays out with a very common name today. Let's look at Zachary.
Oh, circling back to Zachary, I love this.
To understand the architecture of the name Zachary, the source document shifts our focus from the Psalms to the book of Exodus, specifically Exodus chapter 3, verse 15.
What happens there?
This is a critical junction in the text because it explicitly welds the concept of the divine name to a specific human action,
Yeah.
memory. The verse contains the declaration, "This is my name forever," and immediately follows that with a structural parallel, "and this is my memorial to generation after generation."
Oh, wow. So the name and the memorial are permanently locked together.
Completely locked.
You can't have one without the other. They are 2 sides of the same theological coin.
Exactly. Now, to see the mathematical blueprint, we have to isolate the original Hebrew root word that is being translated into English as memorial or remembrance.
What's the root?
That root word consists of 3 Hebrew letters, Zain, Kaf, and Resh. We can transliterate those into our alphabet as ZKR.
ZKR's Zakar.
Zakar, yes. And the source leans on standard lexical tools, like Strong's Concordance, to define the precise boundaries of this word. Strong's defines it broadly as to remember, to mention, to recount. But the primitive foundational sense of the word is crucial here.
Okay, what is it?
The fundamental definition is to mark so as to be recognized.
Remark so as to be recognized. That is a highly physical definition.
Very physical.
Because when I think of the word remember today, it's a completely internal, passive, mental state. I remember that I need to buy milk. I remember what a movie was about. It's fleeting.
Right, it's just a thought.
But marked for recognition sounds like an action. It sounds like taking a chisel and physically altering a stone so that someone walking by 100 years later will stop and notice it.
It is intensely active and physical. The document emphasizes this distinction heavily. In the ancient Near Eastern context, the ZKR root is not weak nostalgia. It is not a fond memory of a past event.
It's a monument.
Yes, it is a tangible structural preservation. It is the active preservation of recognition.
And this is where the sheer genius of this mathematical architecture becomes undeniable.
It really does.
Because we take that active 3-letter root for marked remembrance, -ZKR, and we look at how it intersects with human identity. The source examines the ancient Hebrew name that eventually became Zachary in English.
Let's break it down.
In Hebrew, the specific spelling being isolated is exactly 5 letters, right? Zain, Kaf, Resh, Yod, Hey.
Yep. Let's apply our rule of letter custody to those 5 letters.
Yeah.
ZKRIA.
Okay, we break it down into its constituent blocks. The first 3 letters are ZKR. That is the memorial root, the active marker of remembrance.
Correct.
And the final 2 letters are Yodhe, which we have firmly established is IA, the foundational 2-letter name.
So what happens when you put them together?
If you run the equation, ZKR plus IA, the name literally translates to IA remembers, or remembrance of IA, or memorial of IA.
The literal structural meaning is unavoidable when you look strictly at the raw letter count. ZKRIA equals ZKR plus IA.
Think about the weight of that. If you are listening to this right now and your name is Zachary, or you know a Zachary, you are carrying around an equation.
You're wearing a monument.
You aren't just wearing a phonetic label that sounds pleasant. The spelling itself is the theology. An ancient person given that name wasn't just being called a name, they were being designated as a physical walking container for the Exodus 3.15 contract.
Exactly. The text says, this is my name, and this is my ZKR.
And the human being named ZKRIA literally embodies that verse in 5 letters. That's unbelievable.
It demands that we view these people not just as historical actors, but as living, breathing texts.
I mean, it's brilliant, but...
Here comes the but.
Well, anyone who studies Hebrew manuscripts will immediately raise a red flag here, because the source document acknowledges that there isn't just one single spelling for this name in the ancient records. There are longer variations.
Right. It's never quite that simple, is it?
Never. Manuscript traditions are messy. Scribes make changes over centuries. So how does the source handle the variations?
This is a crucial point of methodology in the deep dive. The source notes that standard lexicons and concordances will list the name Zechariah as being formed from the root Zechar plus the divine name element. But those lexicons often group different spellings together.
Give me an example.
Well, for instance, there is a very common longer form of the name, Zechariahu.
Zechariahu. So it has extra letters at the end.
It adds a wa, u, or ww sound to the very end of the sequence. It is a longer spelling. Now, a standard lexicon will group the 5 letters ZKRIA and the 6 letters Zechariahu into the exact same dictionary entry.
Because they share the same lexical root.
Exactly. They both mean generally the same thing in terms of translation.
I want to stop right there, because this is where I get skeptical again.
Go for it.
If a massive scholarly lexicon produced by linguistic experts says that ZKRIA and Zechariahu are essentially the same word, just spelled slightly differently, who are we to argue?
They are experts, after all.
Right. Isn't that just how language works? It's like having an apple and a slightly larger apple. The grocery store puts them in the same bin and calls them both apples. Why does this source insist on separating them?
The source draws a hard, unyielding line between lexical classification and orthographic identity. Yes, they share the same root meaning, but a dictionary grouping them together does not magically erase the extra letter from the physical page.
Oh, I see. It's the difference between chemistry and cooking.
Okay, I like where this is going.
A cook might look at salt and sugar and say, well, they are both white powders you add for flavor, just put them in the pantry. But a chemist looks at the atomic structure and says, one is sodium chloride and the other is sucrose. They are fundamentally, structurally, entirely different things.
Exactly. To use a scientific analogy, think of them like isotopes.
Isotopes.
Yeah. Carbon-12 and carbon-14 are both carbon. They have the same number of protons. But carbon-14 has extra neutrons. It has a different atomic mass. A biologist might just call it all carbon in a general conversation, but to a physicist measuring atomic decay, those extra neutrons are the most important part of the equation.
Because it changes the math.
Right. ZKRIA and Zechariahu are isotopes. The source document is acting as the physicist. It is measuring the precise atomic mass of the letters. 5 letters are not 6 letters.
Okay, I follow.
If the entire argument of letter custody depends on whether the foundational anchor is the pure 2-letter Yod-He, which is IA, or a larger 3-letter complex, then every single letter matters.
And ZKRIA strictly preserves the 2-letter IA ending.
While Zechariahu does not.
So the source is saying we must isolate the precise 5-letter container, ZKRIA, to see the pure mathematical equation. The spelling is the boundary.
It absolutely is.
And if that active root, CKR, creates a container for memory, it naturally makes you wonder what happens when you introduce a different variable into the equation. What happens if we swap out the root for memory with something even more aggressive?
Something that defines the entire narrative arc of these ancient texts, maybe.
Exactly. Which brings us to the concept of deliverance or rescue.
We're going to look at one of the most monumental figures in ancient literature, the prophet Isaiah, and we're going to see how this exact same five-letter boundary law is applied to a new structural witness.
But this is where the friction between the ancient code and our modern English translations becomes really intense, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, we have to confront a phantom letter that English has basically smuggled into the text.
Okay, let's set up the equation first. We need a new root block. We are removing ZKR and we are substituting a new Hebrew root, Yasha,
Yasha.
and it is spelled with three letters, Yod, Shin, Ayin.
If we look at Strong's Concordance, specifically root H3467, the definition of Yasha is to save, to deliver, to rescue, to bring to safety. It is the foundational Hebrew root for the entire concept of salvation.
So it implies moving someone from a place of distress or danger into a place of expansive safety.
Yes, that's exactly the imagery.
Okay, so we take that root save, deliver, rescue, and we look at the raw original Hebrew spelling for the name of the prophet Isaiah. The source isolates a specific five-letter original witness, Yod Shin Ayin Yod Hey.
Let's run the exact same conversion we did for Zachary.
All right, I can do this. Yod is I, Shin is S, Ayin is A. That's the Yasha root, which gives us I-S-A.
Okay.
Then we have the final two letters, Yod Hey, which is I-A, the two-letter name. So the complete sequence is I-S-A-I-A, Isaiah.
Now break it down into its blocks.
Isa plus IA, salvation, plus IA, salvation of IA, or IA saves.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
The architecture is flawless. It's the exact same structural template as ZKRIA, just with the new action block slotted into the front. ZKRIA was IA remembers, ISA as IA saves.
It is a perfectly balanced mathematical statement.
Yeah.
But as you alluded to, this pure five-letter sequence runs headfirst into a massive wall when it encounters modern English.
The phantom letter.
Yeah. How do you spell Isaiah in an English Bible today?
ISAIAH. It ends with an H. It's 6 letters.
And that English H completely obscures the original architecture. The source document is relentless on this point. The original Hebrew spelling under examination is 5 letters. Yod Shin Ayin Yod He.
Right, there is no extra H.
The final He that open A sound at the end of IA is already the 5th and final original letter on the page. There is no 6th letter in that specific Hebrew sequence.
So when English translators tacked that H onto the end, they weren't translating a letter that was actually there, they were adding a phonetic breath mark.
Exactly.
They were trying to capture how they thought the word should sound when spoken aloud, and they just materialized a physical letter to do it.
Yeah.
They double-counted the ending.
They introduced a phantom letter. And the source argues that an English translation tradition does not have the authority to retroactively add a consonant to the math.
You can't just change the code because you think it sounds better.
You cannot count the final breath twice. If the governing law is original letter custody, that English H must be stripped away entirely. The restored, mathematically precise witness is Isa, 5 letters.
Not Isaiah.
Right, and not Isaias, as you might see in some Latin or Greek traditions.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here again, because my brain keeps returning to the manuscript variations we talked about with Zachary.
Oh, the isotopes.
The isotopes, yes. We established that Zachary had a 6-letter version, Zechariahu. Doesn't Isaiah have the exact same issue? Isn't there a longer 6-letter version of Isaiah in the Hebrew text?
Yes, absolutely. And the source document faces this directly. It rigorously distinguishes between the 5-letter Isaiah, which we just established as Isaiah, and a common 6-letter variant known as Yeshayahu.
Yes, Shayok. Okay, let's spell that one out.
Yeshayahu is spelled Yod Shin Ayin Yod He Wa. It adds that 6th Hebrew letter, the Wa, to the very end of the sequence. 6 Hebrew characters.
And just like with Zachary, if I go to an online tool like Bible Hub right now and look up the Hebrew word for Isaiah, Strong's HC470, it's going to show me both of those forms in the same entry, isn't it?
It absolutely will.
It's going to say Isaiah or Yeshayahu, as if they are completely interchangeable. So why are we drawing such a hard line in the sand and refusing to accept the Wa? If ancient scribes use both, why can't we?
Because of what we discussed regarding classification blurring. A lexicon is a dictionary of meanings. It groups words by their semantic value.
Right.
Yeshayahu and Isaiah both contain the salvation root, Ikai. They both point toward the same historical prophet. Semantically, they mean the same thing, but structurally, architecturally, they're different containers.
The isotope analogy again, they have different atomic weights.
Precisely. And in this specific deep dive, the atomic weight is the only thing that matters.
Mm.
The source insists that a classification statement is not an orthographic identity statement.
Grouping them together doesn't erase the Wa.
Grouping related forms in a dictionary does not make that 6th letter magically vanish from the physical parchment. 5 letters are not 6 letters. ISAA ends in the pure 2-letter name, IA. Yechahahu ends in a 3-letter cluster, IA, Wa. They share the salvation body, but they have fundamentally different endings.
It requires such a disciplined, almost rigid way of thinking.
It really does.
I mean, we are so used to fluid language. We use slang, we abbreviate words, we misspell things in text messages, and we all know what we mean. We value the meaning over the form. But this text is arguing that in these ancient engineered scriptures, the form is the meaning. If you alter the form by even one letter, you lose the signal.
Translating these names purely by phonetics across centuries is like leaving a finely carved marble statue out in wind and rain.
Oh, that's sad.
Over time, the sharp edges of the letters erode. An H it gets added here, a WA gets blended in there because it sounds smoother to the ear. The original crispness of the equation is lost.
But by returning to the raw, unadorned 5 letters, we put the statue in a vacuum chamber. We restore the sharp edges. We see the exact intended equation, salvation plus IA.
Exactly.
And as brilliant as that is, it's still somewhat linear. We've just been snapping blocks together like Legos, ZKR plus IA, ISA plus IA. But the source material is about to take these Legos and build something that is, frankly, mind-bending.
Oh, this is my favorite part.
Because what happens when you take those exact same structural blocks, the salvation root and the name, and you reverse their order?
This is where we encounter what the document calls the salvation mirror.
The salvation mirror.
We are going to examine the architecture of the name Joshua. But to see the reflection in this mirror, we first have to understand a very ancient, very specific rule about how one particular Hebrew letter functioned in antiquity. We have to reckon with the letter Wa.
Okay, let's lay the groundwork. What is the raw 5-letter spelling of the name Joshua in Hebrew?
The Hebrew spelling isolated by the source is exactly 5 letters, Yod-He-Wash-I-En.
Let me map that out mentally. Yod-He-Wah Shin Ayin. It's fascinating how much English obscures here. The English spelling Joshua gives us a J and an O at the front, but the original Hebrew begins with Yod-He.
Which is?
IA. The foundational 2-letter name is sitting right there, immediately at the front of the sequence.
Correct. The first 2 letters are IA, then you have the remainder of the sequence, Wa, Shin, Ayin.
Now, Shin and Ayin, we know those, that's S and A. That is the back half of the salvation root, Yasha or Isa. So we have the name at the front and the salvation root at the back.
But there is a massive obstacle sitting right in the middle of the word.
That 3rd letter, the Wa. Yod-He-Wah Shin Ayin. How on earth do we handle the Wa? Because earlier you mentioned that Wa had a W or U sound.
This is where the source introduces a critical paradigm shift in how we read ancient scripts. The document explains that standard conventional Hebrew grammar, like the grammar taught in most universities today, usually views the letter Wa simply as a vowel letter.
Okay.
The technical linguistic term is metalectionis.
Metalecciones, which means what?
It means mother of reading.
Mother of reading, meaning it was added to help the reader know which vowel sound to make, since ancient Hebrew was mostly written with just consonants.
Exactly. In later vocalization systems, like the one developed by the Masserees centuries later to standardize pronunciation, the Wa was often associated with an O or a U sound.
Which perfectly explains why we have an O and a U in the English pronunciation Joshua. We're just inheriting that later vowel pointing system.
Yes, but the document we are analyzing rejects that later system for this specific structural analysis. It argues for what it calls a Paleo-Hebrew letterhouse reading.
Paleo-Hebrew. So we're going back even further, to the earliest iterations of the script. What does it mean to read it as a letterhouse?
It means we are not merely repeating a later system that added vowel points to dictate phonetics. We're reading the letter Wa by its ancient original pictographic meaning.
Like hieroglyphics.
Kind of, yeah. In the oldest forms of the script, letters were derived from physical pictures. And the ancient pictograph for Wa was a tent peg, a hook, or a connector.
A hook. That is very tangible.
And this leads to what the text calls the rule of the hook. If the fundamental structural identity of Wa is a connector, it does not invent a brand new phonetic sound out of thin air. A hook doesn't exist in isolation. It connects things. It hooks. It binds. It returns.
Returns to what? Where does the hook go?
It returns back to the beginning of its immediate sound unit.
Okay, break that down for me and Joshua.
Let's look at the sequence again. Yod-He-Wash-I. The sound unit at the beginning of the word starts with the letter Yod. It does not start with He. The absolute beginning of the sequence is I, followed by the breath A.
Right.
Therefore, when the wa acts as a Paleo-Hebrew hook, it hooks back to the beginning of the unit. It hooks back to the yod, which carries the I value.
That is incredible. I want to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly because this fundamentally changes how you read the word. It's almost like reading a piece of code.
Yes.
The wa is acting like a loop command in a computer programming script. It sits there in the middle of the sequence, and when the reader hits it, the command says, return to the start of the current array and fetch that first value again.
The coding loop analogy is brilliant because it perfectly captures the structural mechanics. The wa loops back and pulls the initial I value forward into the middle of the word.
So if we run the code, let's compile the name Joshua using the rule of the hook. We start with yod-he, that's I-A.
Yep.
Then we hit the wa, the loop command triggers, hooking back to the yod, bringing an I into the middle. And then we finish with the shin and ayin, which are S-A. So the full sequence, read through this structural lens, becomes I-A-I-S-A.
I-Isa. Now, step back and look at the architecture we have just uncovered.
Yeah.
Think back to the 5-letter name of Isaiah we mapped out in the previous section.
Isaiah was Isa plus I-A, I-I-A.
And Joshua, through the ancient rule of the hook, is I-A plus Aya. I-A-S.
It's a mirror. It is a flawless structural reflection. Isaiah is I-S-I-I. Joshua is I-A-I-S-I. It's a linguistic palindrome built out of the exact same two blocks.
They are not the same name. They do not have the same raw spelling.
Yeah.
But mathematically, structurally, they are perfect reflections of the exact same principle. And the source document argues that this mathematical perfection is not an accident. It contains profound theological poetry that mirrors the historical functions of these two figures.
What do you mean? How does the math mirror their history?
Think about who these two men were in the scriptural narrative. Isaiah was a prophet. His role was to stand and declare things. He declares the salvation of Ia,
Okay.
and his name reflects that. It places the action first, the salvation root first, which is Ia, and it places the name second, Ia,
Yeah.
pointing to it. He announces it.
I-S-A-A. Action then name.
Exactly. But Joshua was a very different figure. He was a military commander. He was the one who actually led the people across the Jordan into the Promised Land. He enacts Ia salvation.
Oh, I see it.
His name places the divine name first, Ia, and then carries the salvation action forward, Ias.
That is just, it is staggering. You have Isaiah on one side declaring the salvation. You have Iasa on the other side enacting it. The mathematical structure perfectly reflects their respective roles in the historical narrative.
Yeah.
You do not get a perfect conceptual and structural mirror like that by accident.
No, you don't.
It implies a level of meticulous architectural planning by the original authors that borders on superhuman.
It is an incredibly compelling piece of structural analysis. However, the author of this text anticipates dissent. A skeptic is going to look at this and say, this is too convenient. You are just manipulating the translation of the wa to force the math to work. You're inventing a rule to make a palindrome.
Which is exactly what a skeptic would say.
Right. So the document performs a rigorous stress test on its own rule.
A stress test. I love that. How do you stress test an ancient grammatical rule?
You apply that exact same rule, the rule of the hook, to a variant spelling and see if the architecture holds or collapses. The source brings back the 6-letter version of Isaiah we discussed earlier, Yeshayahu.
Ah, okay. Let's see if it breaks.
Remember, Yeshayahu is spelled Yod-Shineni Yod-He-Wa. It has a wa at the very end of the sequence.
Okay, let's run the code on Yeshayahu. The first 5 letters are the same, I-S-A-I-A. But then we hit that final wa. According to the rule, the wa acts as a hook. It hooks back to the beginning of its immediate sound unit.
Right.
The immediate unit at the end of the word is the Yod-He-Wa cluster. The beginning of that specific cluster is the Yod, which is I. So the wa pulls the I value forward.
So what does the full 6-letter sequence become when compiled through the hook rule?
It becomes I-S-A-A-I. I-S-A-A-I.
Exactly, Isaiah. And this, the source argues, proves the point definitively. Even if a skeptic grants the Paleo-Hebrew hookback reading for the wa, the 6-letter Yeshayahu still does not become the 5-letter Isaiah.
It's still 6 letters.
Yes. The wa doesn't just vanish, it adds a return. Isaiah remains the pure, mathematically balanced Isaiah. Yeshayahu becomes the distorted 6-letter Isaiah.
The extra letter still breaks the perfect mirror.
Yeshayahu cannot erase Isaiah's pure Ia ending, and it cannot mirror Joshua's Iisa.
It's internally consistent. It creates a closed loop of logic. If you apply the rule fairly across the board, the pure 5-letter sequences form a perfect mirror, and the longer 6-letter sequences break it. It forces you to respect the exact letter count.
It's bulletproof math within its own framework.
But as compelling as this is, I can imagine a listener raising a very valid structural objection right now. Everything we have discussed so far, Zachary, Isaiah, Joshua, is based in ancient Hebrew.
Sure.
Hebrew is a highly structured, consonant-heavy language built on 3-letter roots. It was designed for this kind of math. But the biblical text doesn't stay in Hebrew. It jumps to an entirely different language family. What happens when we get to the Greek of the New Testament? Don't these strict Hebrew rules just shatter upon impact with Greek grammar?
That is the ultimate crucible for this theory. Can the architecture survive a complete linguistic paradigm shift? This brings us to the final major argument of the source text, the boundary law and the Greek exception.
Okay, let's hear the Greek exception.
Because the document absolutely tackles this head-on. It specifically analyzes 2 cities mentioned in the Greek Book of Revelation, Philadelphia and Laodicea.
Let's start with Philadelphia. Right out of the gate, we have to acknowledge a glaring fact. Philadelphia is a Greek word. It is not Paleo-Hebrew.
Nope.
It has no Hebrew root. It literally translates to brotherly love in Greek, philos and adelphos.
The source is fiercely transparent about this. It does not try to claim that Philadelphia is secretly a Hebrew word. It explicitly states that Philadelphia is Greek by original New Testament form.
So if it's purely a Greek word, meaning brotherly love, how on earth can it participate in this strict mathematical Hebrew architecture based on the 2-letter name, IA?
It enters the architecture not through a linguistic root, but through its explicit function within the text of Revelation.
Its function.
Yes. Revelation chapter 3 addresses the church in the city of Philadelphia, and the text assigns them a highly specific, unique spiritual commendation. The verse says to Philadelphia, "You have kept my word and have not denied my name."
Have not denied my name. There it is, the name chastity testimony.
Precisely. Revelation 3 explicitly assigns the Church of Philadelphia the function of name custody. So Philadelphia is pulled into the structural matrix because the scripture itself assigns it the function of keeping the word and preserving the name.
Okay, I follow the functional logic. If the text says they kept the name, we should look to see if they literally kept the name. But does the math actually work? Does the Greek spelling hold up to the structural boundary law? Let's break down the Greek.
The Greek spelling of Philadelphia ends with a specific sequence of vowels. Epsilon, iota, alpha.
EIA.
Philadelphia, EIA.
Now, we apply the boundary law that we've been using this entire time. The law allows us to isolate the final 2 letters of that terminal ending. What are the final 2 letters of epsilon, iota, alpha?
Iota, alpha, IA, IA. Yes. The boundary law permits isolating the final iota, alpha, IA, as the terminal name witness, while leaving the epsilon to govern the Greek word form. So, Philadelphia becomes Philadelphia. The terminal Greek witness perfectly matches the foundational 2-letter Hebrew name form, which we established at the very beginning is IA.
Okay, hold on. I have to throw a massive red flag here.
I was waiting for this.
Because I am looking at this and thinking, if you stare long enough at any long word in any language, you are eventually going to find an I and an A sitting next to each other.
It's true.
I mean, Australia ends in IA, California ends in IA. Isn't this just egregious confirmation bias? You have a theory, you scan the Greek text until you find a city with an I and an A, and you declare victory. What about the other churches in Revelation? What about Laodicea?
This is exactly the pushback the source anticipates. The author knows that a skeptic will immediately point to Laodicea, because the Greek spelling of Laodicea also ends in epsilon, iota, alpha. It also ends in ia. The dissenter will argue, if you can pull IA out of Philadelphia, why can't I just cherry-pick IA out of Laodicea?
Right. If the rule is just find an IA, then Laodicea works too.
But the rule is not find an IA. The text is very clear that this is not a free-for-all word search. That would be chaotic and meaningless. The rebuttal rests on a highly rigorous 2-part requirement. The law demands both strict boundary and explicit scriptural function.
Boundary and function, a dual lock system. Okay, walk me through the boundary difference between the 2 cities.
We have to analyze the governing consonant clusters in the Greek text. In Philadelphia, the Greek ending is completely unobstructed. It is just the vowels, epsilon, iota, alpha. The final 2 letters are clean and free to be isolated, iota, alpha.
Okay.
But Laodicea is spelled differently in Greek. It is Laodikeia. It possesses a kappa.
A kappa, a hard K sound.
Yes. The closing sound body of Laodicea is fundamentally governed by that kappa. The structural ending is K-E-I-A. The source argues mathematically that you cannot shatter that Kia cluster as though the kappa didn't exist. You cannot just reach in, rip IA out of the middle of TIA and pretend it stands alone like Philadelphia's clean terminal witness.
It's locked. The kappa acts like a structural deadbolt. And the text points out that this structural difference becomes glaringly obvious when you translate them into English, doesn't it?
It does. In English, Philadelphia visibly ends in IA. Philadelphia, you can see the terminal witness. But Laodicea, when translated into English, ends in EA, Laodic EA. It doesn't visibly end in IA at all. So structurally, at the microscopic boundary level, they're completely different animals.
Okay, so Laodicea fails the boundary test because of the kappa. But what about the function test?
The function difference is even more devastating to the skeptic's argument. Remember, Philadelphia was explicitly praised in the text for keeping the name. What is the textual function of Laodicea in Revelation?
Oh, man. Laodicea gets the absolute worst review in the entire book.
He really did.
They get the lukewarm rebuke. The text says, "Because you are lukewarm, neither hot nor cold, I will spit you out of my mouth." They are entirely destitute of any praise regarding name custody.
Exactly. Laodicea possesses neither the structural boundary, because it is locked within Kiaya, nor the scriptural function, because it receives a severe rebuke, not a commendation. Philadelphia possesses both.
Wow.
Its Greek form contains a clean terminal IA after the epsilon, and the scripture explicitly assigns it the "did not deny my name" testimony. Therefore, applying the rule to Philadelphia is not cherry-picking. It is obeying a highly disciplined, multi-layered legal framework of letter count, structural boundary, and textual function.
If you are listening to this, I want you to appreciate how incredibly airtight that argument is. When I first heard the Greek exception, my immediate reaction was, okay, they're just finding shapes in the clouds.
Sounds like it at first glance.
It totally does. But when you see the dual lock system, like, you must have the exact unobstructed letter count, you must respect the governing consonant clusters, and the text itself must explicitly assign the theological function, it completely destroys the idea that this is random. It is a highly disciplined architecture that manages to survive the massive jump from Hebrew to Greek perfectly intact.
Count the letters, preserve the boundary, obey the witness. That is the overarching thesis of the source document. It dismantles the strongest dissenting arguments by relying entirely on what is visibly, physically present in the text, rather than what later phonetic traditions assumed was there.
We have covered a monumental amount of ground in the last hour. We have essentially dismantled and rebuilt the architecture of ancient scripture. Let's try to synthesize everything we've explored without just repeating the syllabus, because the through line here is astonishing.
The through line is the relentless preservation of a single, immutable formula.
Right. We started by establishing the hardest rule. We have to bypass centuries of telephone games, ignore how things sound, and count the literal marks on the page. By doing that, we uncovered the two-letter foundational block in the Psalms, Yod-He, or IA.
And once we had that cornerstone, we watched the ancient authors build with it. We saw the root for active, marked memory, ZKR, locked together with IA to build Zachary. ZKRA, the literal embodiment of the Exodus memorial.
We saw the root for salvation, IS, locked together with IA to build the prophet Isaiah. And we saw how adding an English H or a Hebrew Wa shatters that perfect equation.
Which led us to the Wa acting not as a vowel, but as an ancient Paleo-Hebrew hook. That hook allowed the name Joshua to loop back upon itself, creating Iasa, a perfect mathematical reflection of Isaiah's Isaiah, mirroring their historical roles of declaring versus enacting salvation.
And finally, we watched that exact same mathematical custody leap across languages into the Greek text of Revelation. Philadelphia, against all odds, met the strict dual lock requirements of boundary and function, preserving the terminal IA witness perfectly in line with its explicit commendation for keeping the name.
So we always arrive at the ultimate question for our listeners. So what?
Right. Why does this matter?
Why should you, living in the modern world, care about the microscopic spelling of a 5,000-year-old name, or the difference between a kappa and an epsilon in a dead language? You should care because this analytical approach demands a staggering level of respect for the written word. We live in an era of massive information overload. We skim articles, we read summaries, we accept phonetic translations as gospel. But this source argues that these ancient texts are not sloppy accidents of history. There is an intentional, microscopic, mathematical architecture at play. The authors were engineering theological meaning down to the individual letter count.
It demands that we exercise critical thinking.
Exactly, and that we stop assuming we fully comprehend a text just because we know how to pronounce a word in English.
It changes everything. For our entire lives, we've been walking through a museum looking at these ancient names like they're pretty paintings on the wall. But today, we took the paintings down, turned them over, and realized they're actually complex circuit boards. We saw the math behind the majesty. And I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you go about your day. We just spent an hour looking at the hidden structure of essentially four words: Zachary, Isaiah, Joshua, and Philadelphia. If the ancient writers were this meticulous, if they were capable of encoding vast, interlocking theological mirrors into the mere counting of letters in just a handful of names, what else is sitting right in front of us? What other massive unseen structures are hiding in plain sight in these texts, just waiting for someone to start reading the English translation and start counting the letters?